Good evening. I'm Matthew Spaulding, Associate Vice President Dean for Hillsdale College here in Washington, D.C. Welcome to the Kirby Center. In his first inaugural, Abraham Lincoln famously talked about the mystic chords of memory, the ones that would swell the chorus of the Union when they are touched by the angels of our better nature. Those chords, if you recall, stretched from every living heart and hearthstone back to every battlefield and patriot grave. It's a question that goes back to ancient time. I have in mind the great Greek myth of Antigone, who she wants to bury her brother who died on the battlefield at Thebes. It's always been a question, what do we do with those killed in battle in foreign lands? Our guest this evening has written a book on the smallest of federal agencies with one of the most noble of missions, to oversee 26 overseas cemeteries honoring 139,000 war dead. The book, which is called War and Remembrance, the story of the American Battle Monuments Commission, I have to say the book is not available because it's already sold out, its first printing, although we have, you can order it, and I encourage you to do so. If you order it, the school, Hillsdale, will ship it to you. And our speaker has book plates, which he will sign here, that you can put in the book. So I strongly encourage you to do that. It's a history of those who take care of those dead. I've started reading it this afternoon. It's a wonderful book. The pictures of the sites, most taken by the author, by the way, are very fascinating. Most of us know Tom Connor. He's the William Harris Professor of Military History at Hillsdale College. He teaches Western Heritage and American Heritage, which are two courses in the Hillsdale core curriculum. He also teaches upper-level courses on European history and the two world wars. He is one of the college's currently longest-serving faculty members. He's also one of the best, and he's been named Professor of the Year. I can't count how many times at this point. And so he's always popular, and I am especially happy to introduce him as a dear friend, and among others, a teacher of both my wife and my daughter. So I give you Thomas Connor.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Matt, for that nice introduction. You stay at a place long enough, you will be, intergenerational in your contacts anyway. But I want to welcome you to this presentation. I hope it will appeal to the better angels of your nature. And there are a couple of people I want to acknowledge and thank before we get into the presentation proper. I certainly want to thank the entire staff here at Kirby Center, Matthew Spaulding, Matthew Morrell, Andrew Heim, all the technical crew who have made it possible to actually display some pictures. The nature of this story, I think, imposes a veritable necessity on whoever's doing it to show pictures of these monuments and the cemetery sites, because therein lay the real beauty of this whole story. But there's another gentleman I'd like to recognize. He's not bashful, but he may not have been expecting this, but it's a great honor for me to have had the full cooperation of the American Battle Monuments Commission across the whole 10 years that I've been working on this book. And my chief contact all that time, when we first met 10 years ago, Michael Conley was the public affairs officer. Now he's the chief of staff at the headquarters office in Arlington, and he's here tonight. So I'd just like to acknowledge and thank Mike again. So I want to talk about the book, what it's about, a little bit about how I came to write it, a little bit about how I put together this story. And finally, we'll give a little sneak preview of some of the, to me anyway, most interesting discoveries that I made while doing the research, and then leave the rest of the discovery of those interesting findings to you, or those of you who do choose to buy the book. And I'm very sorry that it is not available. It's kind of a good problem and a bad problem to have. I think the first printing run was a bit small, but we're hopeful to get more books out there, because I'm very grateful to the Hillsdale College marketing division. They have brought their full weight to bear on getting word out, and I don't think either I or the University of Kentucky Press, which actually published it, was prepared, frankly, for the impact of their efforts. But you see the title of the book. It's called War and Remembrance. I actually learned when I proposed that title to the publisher, they were a little reluctant to agree to it right away, but they ultimately did. You know that's the title of a Herman Wouk novel, his sequel to another Herman Wouk novel, The Winds of War. And I thought the title was suitable, and I'll say the reasons why for that. But strategically, I think you may remember back in 2000, there were a lot of Floridians who voted for Ralph Nader thinking they were going to vote for Al Gore. So I'm hoping that people will buy this book thinking they're going to get one of the great World War II novels. And maybe that might even lead to a third printing. But the book is genuinely about war and remembrance, because those two words, in some ways anyway, sum up the story of the American Battle Monuments Commission. It was founded in 1923 by an act of Congress. That's 5 years after the First World War ended, of course, and it is the product, the existence of this agency, which is now in its 95th year. It was a byproduct of the war, but for World War I and the fact that we lost so many men overseas, and then once it was all over, we had to decide as a government, as a people, where those bodies would ultimately be interred. But for that, there would have been no real need for the American Battle Monuments Commission. But at the end of the war, as it turned out, each family who lost a soldier was given the opportunity to tell the government, the War Department did the canvassing, whether they wanted the body of their dead husband, dead son, dead nephew, whoever it might have been, sent home for private burial in the States, or left in what would ultimately become a permanent American cemetery. And one of the most interesting findings in my own research, because you know there was a second generation of the creation of war cemeteries and memorials after World War II, but the percentage of families that decided they wanted the bodies brought home versus the percentage of those who opted to have the bodies kept in the theater of war and buried in an overseas cemetery was exactly the same at the end of each World War. 61% wanted the bodies brought home, 39% said keep them where the particular individual fell, to be buried with his comrades forever on foreign soil, friendly soil, but foreign soil. So that's the war part of the story of the American Battle Monuments Commission. But the remembrance part, that's the ongoing mission of the agency. The agency is heart and soul committed to fostering, furthering, promoting remembrance of the soldiers who died in our overseas wars. But I think in even the largest sense, they're in the business, part of their mission as they see it is to promote remembrance and honoring of all who have served, survivors and those who made the ultimate sacrifice alike. And in recent years particularly, but Mike is very proud and deservedly so of the efforts the agency has made, particularly in the last 10, 15 years, to beef up their educational programs. And there's a wonderful website, www.abmc.gov, that I encourage all of you to go to just to see the kinds of things they're doing. But I've said to Mike many times, since the agency first began, they've been in the education business, because when you see some of the photographs of the memorials, and monuments particularly. You see they have maps on them, they have inscriptions on them that are designed not just to honor and remember the soldiers, but also to honor and remember the cause for which Americans have historically fought and given their lives in overseas wars. So that's the War and Remembrance part. The ABMC itself is actually two entities. It is an agency. Matt Spaulding described it as the smallest government agency, federal agency. I don't know for a fact that that's true. Mike may know. But for $75 to $80 million a year in spending, they do their work. There are a little over 400 employees, most of whom, by a large majority, are foreign nationals, because the business of preserving and maintaining the sites is largely done by foreign nationals, where the cemeteries and monuments are Frenchmen, Belgians, Italians, Dutch, etc. But, and then there are headquarters staff here in Arlington. There's also a sizable contingent in an office outside Paris, the European office. That's one of the entities that the ABMC is. But the second entity it is a commission, an oversight board of 11 members, all presidential appointees. There's a chairman and a secretary and staffers, but then there are the 11 civilian members of the commission. The members of the commission are unpaid. They meet on average, 3 times a year, Mike? More often than not on this side of the pond, but once a year, maybe on average. There's a big anniversary coming up next year, the 75th anniversary of D-Day, and Mike just told me at dinner tonight the commission will actually go to Normandy and meet over there next spring. So it's an independent agency, which is something of a miracle, you might say, for an agency so small to have avoided all these years being absorbed by some larger agency. And there were a couple of near misses that I learned about and wrote about in the book. But I think the key person, at least in establishing the agency as an independent agency, was its first chairman, General John J. Pershing, the only soldier in American history to hold the honor of the extraordinary rank of General of the Armies while he was alive. Some people in the Army consider that a 6-star rank, and Pershing was given that rank. He learned about it in September of 1919 as he was literally sailing home from Europe with the mission accomplished of the American Expeditionary Forces, which he commanded, and it was obviously an extraordinary elevation. Pershing is resting now in Arlington National Cemetery, and he is the highest-ranking soldier in that cemetery. But you'd hardly ever know that because he has the simplest headstone possible for anybody to have in that cemetery. So I hope, if you haven't yet, he's buried on Pershing Hill, and you can certainly find it in Arlington and go pay your homage. George Washington, of course, was elevated posthumously to the rank of General of the Armies, but not till 1976 in connection with the bicentennial. So Washington never enjoyed that rank when he was alive. The second chairman, by the way, was General of the Army, George C. Marshall. 11 stars between the first two chairmen of the ABMC. But Franklin D. Roosevelt actually said, it was recorded in a press conference that he gave. I don't know whether this ever got back to General Pershing or not. But by the end of the 1930s, after the first collection of overseas memorials had been built and dedicated, General Pershing himself was suspicious that the agency might go out of business because it had accomplished its mission. But Franklin Roosevelt told a press conference in 1939, he said, as long as General Pershing is alive, I'm not going to touch the ABMC. And it's dodged a couple moments later in its history when it looked like it might be absorbed into a larger agency, but it still remains independent. President Trump has repopulated the members of the commission chairman and secretary. There's just one vacancy, I think, on the commission right now, but the agency reports directly to the president. How did I come to write this book? I've been visiting these overseas sites, many of which you're going to see displayed on the screen momentarily. I've been going to these sites. I made my first visit to the Normandy Cemetery in 1978, and I've been going back frequently with student groups, almost annually since that time. And if any of you have seen any of these sites, you know that their beauty is incomparable, and the quality of the maintenance and the preservation equally incomparable. And I also learned, because when you take a student group to one of the sites, the personnel there, the administrative personnel, supervisory personnel, are always Americans at these sites. They notice you, and so I've been able to have many conversations with staff, enough to know that this is an unusually dedicated and competent group, forthcoming, welcoming without fail, and they love to tell the story of their own sites. But they also are well aware, as I was made aware myself, that very few Americans know the story. So I hope this book will get the word out, so to speak, and bring to the agency and its personnel, and also to the sites themselves, the attention that they have always merited. Another reason why I wrote the book, the other reason, well, one of two other reasons. When I found out and realized that no one else had ever covered this subject, there's no other book that purports to tell the story of the ABMC. I'm a first-time author. I said last week in Hillsdale I never expected to give birth to anything at age 68, but here this book has arrived. But I had the idea about 10 years ago to start it, and Victor Davis Hanson, who is a great friend of Hillsdale College and who was at that time a member of the commission, I ran the idea by him when we were traveling in Europe, and without hesitation he said, yeah, do it, because he was aware as a commissioner that there was no book-length history of the commission. So, and that's, I knew enough about writing books to know that that's every author's dream, to come by a topic that nobody else has really done. So that was the second reason. Thirdly, ever since I was a college student, I've been in the grips of World War I. It's really the event in history that I'm most passionate about. Ever since I read Barbara Tuchman's The Guns of August as a college sophomore, I've always had this yearning to learn more about World War I, but also to talk about it, as I do in about 16 different classes back at Hillsdale College. But this book is obviously about an agency that has had a mission through both world wars, but there is a certain imbalance, I freely concede, in my own coverage of this story in favor of World War I. There's 7 chapters in the book. 4 of them deal with the aftermath of World War I, even before anyone knew there was going to be a Second World War. The 5th chapter deals with the fate of the monuments and cemeteries from the First World War, while the Second World War came first through the territory as the Germans invaded France and Belgium, where all our, northern France and Belgium, where all our World War I sites, except for the cemetery in England, are. The war came through there in 1940 and then back through there in 1944, General Eisenhower's force. And Ike actually had a stint attached to the ABMC in the late 1920s. And one of the most touching things I found in my own research was a telegram that General Eisenhower sent to General Pershing on the occasion of Pershing's 84th birthday, September 13th, 1944. If you know your chronology of the Second World War in detail, you know that by September 1944, most of northern France and a goodly portion of Belgium had been liberated. So Ike was able to, and Ike had already sent out officers, go here, go there, and check on the condition of our cemeteries and World War I monuments. And those officers had reported back to Ike, so he sent Pershing a telegram on his birthday and said, just thought you'd like to know that the monuments, which Ike knew that Pershing had poured his own heart and soul into creating, he knew then that they were safe. So, but that's the 5th chapter. Then there's a chapter on the building of the World War II memorials and a conclusion which basically compresses the history of the last 50 or 55 years of the agency into about 20 pages. Mike has already teased me about a second book or a second edition, an expanded edition. I had a word limit when I signed the contract for this book. I did intend to cover the later years a little more thoroughly, but had to abandon that hope, but maybe we'll pick it up again at some point. How did I do the book? Since there was very little literature on the ABMC, the overwhelming bulk of the research is archival. And I learned this as a graduate student, and I kind of make a joke about it, but archival history to me is doing history in the raw. You read the documents. I handled all kinds of letters signed personally by Calvin Coolidge, Franklin Roosevelt, Pershing. I handled a number of Pershing correspondence, handwritten letters that came back from wartime France with reports on how the monuments and cemeteries were doing. The official records of the agency are in the National Archives out at College Park. I went to the archives downtown to look at records of the Commission of Fine Arts, which was another commission, actually a little older than the ABMC, but the Fine Arts Commission, as some of you may know, is responsible for overseeing the artistic quality of any memorial built by the United States government. So the agency is still beholden to the Fine Arts Commission for approval of its own artistic designs whenever they want to do anything on the cemetery grounds or monument grounds overseas. General Pershing's private papers were a big source for me there in the Library of Congress. General Marshall's personal papers are in the Marshall Library in Lexington, Virginia. I went there. I went out to the Eisenhower Library in Abilene, Kansas. Had a wonderful week out there back in 2010 or 2011, reviewing. I made very detailed notes on the year that he spent with the ABMC, and I got a lot out of that. There are archival holdings in each one of the cemeteries. There are archives in the European office outside Paris. I worked very selectively there, with the possible exception of the Normandy Cemetery, where the archival holdings are most extensive. But a lot of the records in the overseas sites have not really been sorted through catalogs, so it's kind of a challenge to get much out of them. But I did get my fair share of nuggets, I think, out of that material too, including one of the most fascinating events recorded in the files held at the Normandy Cemetery were accounts of Steven Spielberg's time there for the filming of Saving Private Ryan back in 1997. And one of the most moving things about that was to see evidence that actually came out in the press months later, in some cases, but evidence of how the cemetery had affected both Spielberg and the star of the movie, Tom Hanks. They were very candid about Tom Hanks, in fact, said that when he first arrived in the cemetery, he thought only of the crosses, the headstones, the stars of David that marked the graves. But the longer he was there, the more he realized that underneath each of those headstones was a human life, the remains of a human being whose life had been cut short. And I know this is part of the ongoing ambition of the agency, is literally to do everything it can to bring those dead soldiers, fallen soldiers, to life, even years after they actually lost their lives in either of the two world wars. What were some of the most interesting discoveries? I'll try to just throw out a couple, and then we'll turn to the slides, and I'll narrate as we go. But there was a very surprising controversy back in the 1920s in relation to that choice that I noted earlier was given to each of the families, if you can believe this. But the journalistic community, and there were actually some committees organized to further one viewpoint or another. But a lot of people who didn't necessarily have a direct stake because they didn't have a fallen soldier in their family, but they weighed in on the choice they thought the families of dead soldiers should make. There were partisans of both points of view. Those who thought the body should be brought home tended to be skeptical of the idea of leaving fallen American soldiers abroad, especially in a place like France. Believe it or not, that soon after the war, there was a certain skepticism as to how the French might treat the interments of large numbers of American soldiers. Would they look to exploit the fact that Americans would come overseas to visit the sites, et cetera? But those who thought that the bodies should remain overseas were suspicious of the funeral director's lobby in the United States, that's the real reason why families were being pressured to have their dead family members brought back. So, and it was almost an unseemly quality to that debate. Not as bad necessarily as the debates we're living through right now in our politics, but considering how sensitive an issue it is for families to decide where they want a loved one buried, I was quite taken aback by that. I certainly gained a very deep appreciation and broad appreciation of the contribution that General Pershing made to the work of the agency. I've already referred to that. But, and similarly with General Marshall. But the interesting thing about these findings is that there's a rich biographical literature on both these great Americans, but very little to nothing of any consequence on the service that Pershing gave the last 25 years of his life to the ABMC, and that Marshall gave as chairman for the last 10 of his life. The third and fourth chairman, by the way, were also, like General Marshall, World War II generals. Jake Devers, who had been the 6th Army Group Commander, among other roles that he played in the Second World War. He's the only one of the first 4 chairmen to have been at every single meeting that took place during his chairmanship. General Eisenhower appointed him. President Nixon relieved him at the end of the 1960s because of General Devers' advanced years. But then the 4th chairman was General Mark Clark, who served for the last 15 years of his life. I don't know how many of you know much about General Clark. His generalship is normally not praised unless it's General Clark talking about it. But he wrote President Carter a letter shortly after Mr. Carter took office. I think General Clark might have been concerned that President Carter might relieve him of this position because President Nixon had initially appointed Clark, but he said, frankly, Mr. President, this is the highest honor that my country's ever conferred upon me, to be chairman of this commission. So, and I'm sure all of his successors have felt similarly. So that was an interesting discovery to see this succession of very significant and great generals who gave their final service to their country in this role. And finally, I've already mentioned this, but the sort of ongoing tension, you might say, between the agency as an independent agency and the rest of the bureaucracy, which threatened on a number of occasions to absorb it, to see how that bullet kept being dodged, was a very interesting discovery as well. So I'd like to go for the remaining 15 or 20 minutes to the slides and just talk about what you're seeing, obviously, and elaborate a bit on some of the backstory to the images so that can convey a bit more about the history, the agency. This is what you would see when you enter the reception area of an overseas cemetery. A photograph of the current commander-in-chief. When this picture was taken, it was President Obama. Then you have the secretary of the commission and the head of the European office. It was Max Cleland. And Mike, do you recognize that picture on the right? Okay, General Hawkins. And then underneath, you have the whole collection of former chairmen, starting with Pershing to the left, and General Frederick Franks, who was a George W. Bush appointee who was removed from the position on the day that President Obama took office, but General Merrill McPeak, who was Mr. Obama's choice for chairman, had not been in office long enough to be pictured there. But this is a statue of General Pershing in his hometown in Missouri. Any of you know the hometown? I don't even think there's a traffic light there. It's in the northwestern part of Missouri. It's a place called Laclede. Pershing left there in 1881, I believe, to go to West Point, and the rest, as they say, is history. Now, this is arguably the most important single World War I monument in France. It's on a hill called Montfaucon in the MeuseArgonne battle area. It's a 175-foot-high Doric column capped by a Statue of Liberty. And the Statue of Liberty on top is looking out into the infinity of time and space in the direction from which the American troops came. The Battle of the MeuseArgonne began on the 26th of September, 1918. It ended on Armistice Day at 11 o'clock in the morning. It's a 47-day-long battle. It's the bloodiest battle in American history. 122,000 casualties, dead and wounded together. It's the bloodiest battle in American history because it was a very intense battle, but it also lasted over a long period of time. The Battle of the Bulge is a very close second in terms of the overall casualties from 1944-45. But this monument was dedicated on the 1st of August, 1937. General Pershing was there. Marshal Pétain was there, the commander of the French army during the last couple years of the First World War. The president of the French Republic was there, and President Roosevelt was on his yacht in the Potomac, but he gave a live radio address that the audience heard. Most of the Frenchmen, of course, couldn't understand it, but it was something of a path-breaking undertaking, and it came off successfully for a live radio broadcast to actually reach its audience. The monument was erected on the ruins of a village called Montfaucon, and that's the ruins of the village church. The French government gave us the ground, but we didn't really take full possession of it until we'd worked out a liability agreement with the French, because they considered it a dangerous place, and it probably still is. The ground underneath it's honeycombed with underground bunkers. There's still, if you look hard enough, you can cut yourself on rusty barbed wire even to this day. The architect for the monument was John Russell Pope, who later did the Jefferson Memorial, and had a very testy relationship, Pope did, with the secretary of the commission at the time, but he was given this chore in recognition of the fact that he was one of the great architects of his day. The next three shots are just shots from the top of the memorial, and as you look at each one, realize again that you're looking at the bloodiest battlefield in American history. The monument occupies a commanding spot. One can see miles from there, and one can see the monument miles away from it. And all that's deliberate. Pershing wanted these memorials to be seen from miles away because he hoped that anyone who saw the monument would just have to come get a closer look and actually visit it. And anyone who visited there would be reminded of what the Americans had contributed to the war effort. The second biggest monument of World War I vintage is on a hill called Mont Sec, south of Verdun. It was in the Saint-Mihiel sector. The Battle of Saint-Mihiel began on the 12th of September 1918. It was the first major battle that the United States fought as an independent army. And this monument crowns its height to this day. First you saw a perspective from distance, now you see it closer up. But next you're going to see the view from the memorial. So this monument was actually rather heavily damaged during World War II by American tank fire. The Germans were there in the closing weeks of August or beginning weeks of September. The Americans had to blast them out of there, and the monument was hit several times, but easily enough repaired in the aftermath of the war. Now this monument is the third most important monument. It's on Hill 204, which is military language for a hill outside ChteauThierry in France, about 35 miles east of Paris. The architect for the monument was the first consulting architect for the commission, a Frenchman transplanted to Philadelphia, where he was on the faculty of the School of Architecture at the University of Pennsylvania. Paul-Philippe Cret was his name, C-R-E-T. He designed that memorial. It's the En Marne Memorial. The commission just opened up a new visitor center underneath the memorial, which I was able to visit last spring. It's an extraordinarily fine piece of work, very informative panels, and they even have some footage of Pershing giving his dedicatory address at the MeuseArgonne Monument. And here's the ever-present map to which I made reference earlier. It's designed to acquaint people who visit the monument with some of the action that took place around it. One of the smaller memorials, World War I memorials, there were 11 World War I memorials altogether, is in the village of Cantigny. Some of you may know that the 1st Division saw action there at the end of May 1918. They drove the Germans out of this village and then managed to hold it against the inevitable German counterattack, and it was a big plus for the Americans. The first time really that we'd been bloodied in an action that we took pretty much by ourselves. And the monument is right in the center of the little village in Picardy, I think it is, in France, and then the ever-present map and explanatory panels again. This monument is on top of a ridge in Champagne. It's called near the village of Saint-Pie. The dedicatory plaque there saying that the monument is plainly erected to remind people how grateful the United States is for the service of the men in this area, the soldiers in this area. This is the view from the top of the memorial. You can see down in the foreground, they're German trenches that still survive. They're actually meant to survive. And this just simply reemphasizes the point that the agency, the ABMC, was very much intent to put its cemeteries and its monuments right on the battlefields. There are individual panels along the base of the memorial honoring the divisions that did the bulk of the fighting there. You see the 2nd 36th Division, and this other plaque refers to the 42nd Division. That was the Rainbow Division. So many of the divisions in World War I were organized state by state. but the 42nd Division was known as the Rainbow Division. That's the division Douglas MacArthur fought with, and that's because it literally had soldiers in it from coast to coast, like a rainbow stretching across the continent. This is what the cemeteries actually look like. A very different look from what you see at Arlington. For one thing, the headstones are much higher off the ground, and they are overtly, I dare say unapologetically, unabashedly religious shapes. Latin cross for the Christian dead, Star of David for the Jewish dead. This is from the MeuseArgonne Cemetery, which is the largest ABMC cemetery in Europe. There are over 14,000 men buried there, and about half the total dead from that battle. And very sad to say that no American president has ever visited there. That's perhaps all the evidence we need to suggest how little remembered, even in the centennial year, I fear to say, the Great War is for us. Every cemetery has a chapel. This is the MeuseArgonne Chapel in Romanesque style. Chapel is on the highest part of the cemetery, so there's a very panoramic view approaching it. This palm was actually left on the altar of the chapel on dedication day for the cemetery, which was Memorial Day 1937. It was left there by the President of France, and he was there in General Pershing's company. This is what the cemeteries look like on Memorial Day. Each individual grave is decorated. In this case, because this is a French cemetery, this is the Voisin Cemetery, our second largest World War I cemetery. You see an American flag and a flag of the host country. If it were in Belgium, it would be a Belgian flag, in Italy, an Italian flag from World War II, so forth and so on. So, but it makes for a spectacular sight, and all those flags are put in by hand as well. This is what the interior of a chapel can look like. This is the Bellow Wood Chapel, but again, unabashedly Christian symbols inside, inscriptions, stained glass windows. In this one, I can't see them, but they're there. And up and down the walls, in this particular case, names of the missing as well. Each of the cemeteries obviously honors those buried there, but there are walls of the missing each place, so the total number of soldiers honored is actually in excess of those with individual interments. At the end of World War I, families were given the opportunity to create a verse or some memorable passage that they would like to have engraved on the back of the headstone of their dead loved one. This is an idea that we took from the British. The British created their war cemeteries before we did. And for those of you who ever visited either a World War I or World War II cemetery maintained by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission of the British government, you'll see just about every grave at the base of it has a very moving inscription. First time I ever visited such a cemetery was in Bayeux in Normandy. And my father was along as a World War II veteran, and he read about 6 or 8 of the inscriptions and just couldn't go any further. They're very personal, very loving, very moving. But for some reason, the people of the United States didn't rise to that challenge. There are only 19 headstones in the 29,000 plus headstones with names on them that have those inscriptions. The crosses are of Carrara marble, Italian marble with a beautiful silvery vein to it. There was quite a controversy about that, the idea that we were going to get our material for the headstones from Italy as opposed to using good old American granite. The American Granite Association pitched quite a fit at a succession of commission meetings. Finally, General Pershing had to tell them in 1926 that the issue was closed and they weren't to come back and try to browbeat the commission anymore. In fact, the Italian marble came in at low bid. Granite would have been 3 or 4 times more expensive per headstone, but it was the purity of the whiteness that ultimately, I think, clinched the deal. This is the gravestone of the son of one of the original members of the commission, a woman by the name of Jacqueline Cody Bentley. She was a Gold Star mother from Chicago. She was one of the original 7 commissioners. Her son had died in 1917. He's buried in the Wazane Cemetery. And I have a couple pictures in the book of Mrs. Bentley and also General Pershing at that grave when the entire commission went over there in 1924 to inspect the cemeteries and the monument sites. This is the only piece of privately donated artwork in any of the American cemeteries. It's a beautiful statue of an American doughboy given by a mother whose son is buried in the Saint-Mihiel Cemetery. That's where the statue is. She paid $30,000 for this at the end of the 1920s. And the commission initially voted not to allow the statue in there because they didn't want to have to rule on individual submissions for private donations. But when General Pershing found out a couple years later that the woman in question was the daughter of James G. Blaine, who was Republican nominee for president in 1884, he changed his mind. And Pershing, as a young man, greatly admired Mr. Blaine, so there the statue is. But if they were going to make an exception over anything, I'm glad they did it with that one. This is Superintendent Michael Kuntz. Some years ago, Michael is posted at the Normandy Cemetery now. I believe he's Director of Visitor Services over there, but in 2010, when that picture was taken, he was superintendent at Saint-Mihiel, and he's taken the flags down, which is done every day at every cemetery to symbolize a duty day completed. And I've heard one cemetery superintendent say this. I've read it elsewhere that there's a belief, and I think for very, very sound and poignant reasons, is every soldier buried in one of those cemeteries resting abroad is still serving his country by reminding us all of the price of freedom. This is the Cambridge Cemetery in England, a World War II cemetery now. You can see a little bit difference in architectural style. There, more rectangular chapel building. For example, we don't argue about whether a chapel, as in the case of the World War I chapel, is Gothic or Romanesque. With these, they're more modern. There are about 3,600 of our soldiers buried in Cambridge, the majority of them flyers. And here's the wall of the missing at Cambridge Cemetery, and there are actually more names on the wall of the missing than there are buried in the cemetery. There are over 5,000 names on the wall of the missing. 2 of them would be very well known. I suspect everyone here, Glenn Miller and Joseph Kennedy, Jr. So many were lost, of course, in bombing raids and whatnot, lost in places where their bodies just simply couldn't be recovered. The ever-present battle maps. This is at Cambridge again. Every cemetery chapel has a memorial, an article of remembrance to commemorate the Jewish dead. This is 10 Roman numerals signifying the 10 Commandments with the Star of David. And there you see more of a perspective, but the Jewish symbol is still there at the base of that right-hand pillar. This is the Brittany Cemetery, built very much in the style of the local parish church with the chapel in the middle, built of stone that is native to the area. Beautiful flora, very colorful cemetery. It's actually the second cemetery that we have in Normandy, but I'm just taking a wild guess, but I'll bet for every one person who visits Brittany, 10 or 20 go to the one that overlooks Omaha Beach. Unabashedly religious inscriptions in the interior of the chapel, designed to comfort those who visit. And then finally, we come to what has to be the best known of all of the ABMC sites, the Normandy American Cemetery. This was Memorial Day. 2011. Old Glory flies next to the French tricolor on Memorial Day. Each of the graves decorated with flags of the respective countries. Off in the distance, this picture, you can see the ocean, the channel, when our soldiers landed on D-Day. Once they fought their way off the beach and up the bluffs, they came right across the ground where the cemetery currently is located. Currently, it's not going anywhere, I promise you. Normandy again. And again. This next picture is of two of the sons of President Theodore Roosevelt. On the right-hand side, the headstone inscription is accentuated because Theodore Roosevelt Jr. was a Medal of Honor winner, but next to him is his younger brother Quentin, who actually died in the First World War. But at the request of the Roosevelt family after the Second World War, when the oldest of the Roosevelt brothers wound up in Normandy, Quentin's grave was moved. It's this pair of graves. I think there are over 40 sets of brothers in the Normandy Cemetery to this day, but this is one of the most frequently visited spots. This is the new visitor center dedicated in 2007. And Mike just told me over dinner tonight it's being renovated again, hopefully ready in time for the 75th anniversary next year, when there will surely be a new crush of visitors, including the heads of state, who I'm sure will be there on June 6th. And finally, this picture. The white-haired lady is a World War II widow. Peggy Harris is her name. Her husband, Billy, is buried in the cemetery. He was shot down in June or July of 1944. He was 22 years old. They had just married prior to his going off into the service. For about 60 years, Peggy was not aware that her husband was actually in the cemetery. But she ultimately learned that that's where he was, so she has made a visit. I don't know that she's able to make the trip anymore, but for a string of years, annually, she would be over there on Memorial Day. She never remarried because she never really knew for certain until she learned that her husband was buried in Normandy that he was in fact dead. So everybody knows her. That's her receiving a red rose from a member of the cemetery staff. And that was Memorial Day 2011 as well. And I like to end with this because her story is just one of thousands and thousands of stories, because every one of the headstones marks the grave of someone who was connected in life to a network of friends and family. And the cemeteries are meant, of course, to honor and remember all of those dead soldiers, but it's a call upon us to do the same. So thank you very much.